They chained her to midnight tracks until a blind gunman said, "Free her, or the train hits you." Redstone Gulch was the kind of town where the dust never settled, and the law came in the form of crumpled wanted posters, pinned to walls no one dared to read. A bleached sign over the saloon read Whisper Jacks, though the paint had faded so much it looked more like a ghost of a name than a claim to business. In the late evening, when the wind scraped grit against the windows and the sun bled itself dry behind the canyons, the town belonged to shadows and silence. Officially, there was a marshal, Grant Avery, but folks said his badge weighed lighter than a feather and twice as useless. The real law belonged to the Crowley Riders, a gang of cutthroats who'd turned Redstone Gulch into a nest of fear and violence. They took what they wanted, killed who they pleased, and if anyone complained, they ended up in Boot Hill under a mound of dry earth, with a cross too crooked to matter. At the head of them was Silas Crowley, a man so mean rattlesnakes crossed the road when he came walking. Tall, thin, with a pale, pockmarked face and dead blue eyes, Silas wasn't known for mercy. His word was taken as gospel by his men, rough men with names like Pickett, Reno Sam, and Hollow Bill, each of them with blood on their hands and no better way to live. Eleanor Voss knew the kind. She'd seen them ride through town, tearing up property, leaning too close to the girls working at the saloon, and grinning as the townsfolk ducked away. When her husband, Thomas Voss, refused to pay the gang's monthly protection tax, his body turned up floating in the muddy creek 3 days later, throat cut, face bloated beyond recognition. They called it a drowning. Everyone knew better. Eleanor didn't run. She stayed in the little house on the hill and ran the store Thomas built with his bare hands, each nail driven with care. She fixed rifles, traded cattle hides, and sold dry goods to anyone with the courage to come through her door. And when Silas himself sauntered in one day with 2 of his riders, demanding her compliance, Eleanor met his stare without flinching. "You don't frighten me," she'd said coldly, fingers inches from the loaded derringer beneath the counter. "And if you think I'll pay for the privilege of living, you're mistaken." It made her a legend in the eyes of a few, and a dead woman walking in the eyes of most. And so it was that one crimson evening, under a sky thick with thunderclouds and dusk-heavy air, the Crowley Riders came for her. No one saw it happen. No one intervened. A single scream, muffled by distance, carried on the wind as Eleanor was dragged from her store and out of town to the stretch of track where the midnight train ran from Carson City to Elkhorn Pass. The tracks shimmered in the dying light, rails gleaming like a knife's edge. They chained her there, hands behind her back, ankles bound to the steel, with a length of iron chain stolen from a quarry. Silas crouched next to her, the stink of whiskey and sweat thick around him. "I warned you," he said, almost gently. "Could have made it easy on yourself, darling." Eleanor spat blood at his boots. "You'll die bad, Silas. That's a promise." He chuckled, standing up and signaling his men to mount. "Well, I reckon you'll see soon enough if that train's faster than your mouth." And then they left her, disappearing into the dark, the sound of hoofbeats fading like the closing of a heavy door. As the sun dropped, the town began to stir with uneasy rumors. At Whisper Jack's, men murmured over half-empty glasses about a woman taken to the tracks. By the general store, old Mrs. Kavanaugh wrung her hands, whispering prayers to no one in particular. And in every corner of Redstone Gulch, a name surfaced like a half-forgotten ghost: Jonah Cross. "Heard he's back in these parts," one voice said near the livery. "Blind as a bat now, ain't he?" another replied. "Don't need eyes to kill a man, so they say." Jonah Cross was a legend that never quite died. Years before, he was the fastest draw this side of the Rio Bravo, a gunslinger with a streak of justice in him when the land had precious little to spare. They said he could shoot a coin out of the air and beat the devil himself at a card table. But when a fire took his wife and boy, set by Silas Crowley in the dead of night, Jonah vanished, blind and broken, into the canyons. Now there were whispers. A drifter spotted by the old dry well. Footprints in the sand near Widow Lake. An old man with a cane and twin Colts in worn leather holsters. And the midnight train drew nearer. The whistle sounded far down the line, a lonely wail that seemed to peel the flesh from bone. Townsfolk gathered at the edge of Main Street, eyes darting to the darkness beyond, toward the place where steel met dirt. Some carried old shotguns, others only words of caution and regret. On the tracks, Eleanor lifted her head. Her face was bruised, lips split, one eye nearly swollen shut, but her gaze was fixed on the horizon, defiant. She felt the vibration through the rail, the unmistakable tremble of a locomotive's approach. If this is the end, she thought, then let it be with my head high and my soul unbroken. And she waited, listening for the sound of hooves or gunfire, for salvation or death, whichever came first. The desert wind came in restless waves that evening, kicking up fine, dry dust and the sour tang of old gun oil left in the cracks of battered holsters. It howled through Redstone Gulch like a warning, rattling loose shutters and tugging at the frayed edges of forgotten flags. Even the tumbleweeds rolled low, as if afraid to make too much noise. The town had always known its place, a speck of stubborn life between the canyons and the endless dry horizon. But that night, it felt like the whole world held its breath. Jonah Cross arrived at the outskirts of town, walking through the haze of dusk like a ghost made flesh. His battered hat sagged low over dark glasses, lenses black as sin and twice as empty. A long, weather-beaten duster hung from his shoulders, the hem tattered and dust-stained from years spent in exile. On his left hip rode an ivory-handled Colt, the handle worn smooth by time and grief. His boots struck the ground in slow, steady rhythm, each step carrying a faint echo off the boarded storefronts and cracked wooden porches. The townsfolk didn't greet him. They watched from windows and half-closed doors, their faces lined with wariness, whispers rising like thin smoke. "That can't be him," muttered old Hank Carter, peering through the cracked glass of the saloon. "Jonah Cross is dead," another voice answered. "Ain't no way a blind man walks into Crowley's town alone." But it was him. There was no mistaking the shape of him, nor the weight of his presence. Time had robbed him of sight, but not of purpose. Years before, Jonah had been a name spoken with a mixture of awe and fear from the Rio Bravo to Dead Man's Bluff. He was the fastest gun across 3 territories, a man with a code as ironclad as the rails that now threatened to claim Eleanor Voss. He lived by a simple rule: harm the innocent, and you'd answer to him. And then came the night when Silas Crowley's brother, Jedediah, a drunk and a killer, cornered a girl in the alley behind Whisper Jack's. Jonah intervened, as he always did. The gunfight was quick, brutal, and final. Jedediah's blood soaked the dirt street before the echoes of the shot even faded. Silas never forgave. 3 nights later, Jonah's home was set ablaze, while his wife and young son slept inside. Jonah, too late to save them, fought through the inferno, his skin scorched, his eyes seared by the flames. He stumbled from the ashes blind, the world reduced to darkness and memory. Most said he died soon after. Some whispered he'd wandered into the canyons, mad with grief. The truth was harder. Jonah survived. He learned to hear what others couldn't, to feel the breath of a man standing near, to count steps by the weight of the earth. In the silence of the canyons, he honed the rest of his senses until he no longer needed sight to kill. And now, with vengeance still unclaimed, the past had drawn him back to Redstone Gulch. Marshal Grant Avery stood on the boardwalk outside his office, wringing his hands. He was a man built like a sack of meal, soft, sagging, with a mustache that tried and failed to lend him dignity. His badge hung crooked on his vest, dulled by neglect. "Now hold up, Cross," Avery called weakly as Jonah passed. "Ain't no sense in going out there. It's not your fight." Jonah didn't pause. He kept walking, each step measured, steady. Avery licked his lips. "I can't protect you if you cross Silas. You know that." "You never protected anyone, Avery," Jonah said, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Go back to your bottle." Avery blanched and stepped aside, the cowardice in his bones too thick to disguise. The whistle of the midnight train wailed in the distance, a long, mournful sound that seemed to pull every nerve tight in the town. The sky was heavy with clouds, the rising blood moon casting a crimson hue over the desert. The metal rails glimmered faintly, stretching out of town like twin daggers. Jonah stopped in the middle of the street. He lifted his face slightly, the wind carrying scents and sounds to him. The nervous shifting of horses, the scrape of spurs, the metallic clink of chains, a woman's shallow, pained breathing. He spoke without raising his voice, yet the words carried like a crack of thunder. "Crowley, you out there?" For a moment, nothing. Then came a mocking laugh. From the edge of the tracks, Silas Crowley emerged, his long coat snapping in the wind. He raised a bottle in salute, his men lurking behind him in the gloom like vultures, circling a fresh kill. "Well now," Silas drawled, grinning. "Didn't reckon the blind old coyote still had the teeth to bite. Come to join the lady on the rails, have ya?" Jonah tilted his head, locating the voice by its rhythm, the thick stench of whiskey on Crowley's breath. "Unchain her," Jonah said flatly, "or the train hits you first." Another laugh. The riders snickered, cocking their rifles. The onlookers in town gasped quietly, pulling their children closer, ducking behind curtains. Silas gestured to his men, swaggering forward with a cruel grin. "I'd say you lost your mind, Cross, but truth is, you never had much sense to start. How you gonna shoot what you can't see?" Jonah reached for his Colt. The ivory handle gleamed in the moonlight as his fingers curled around it. He stood relaxed, his face an unreadable mask behind the dark glasses. "I don't need to see you," he replied, voice cold as the desert night. "I can smell the fear on you from here." Silas's grin faltered for the first time. The train's whistle sounded again, closer now, the rails beginning to hum beneath the sand. "I'm only going to say it once more," Jonah called, his stance as sure and centered as the earth beneath his boots. "Free her, or you'll be the first one that engine hits." The silence that followed was thick as tar, every eye fixed on the two men at the end of a dead man's bargain. And somewhere down the track, the midnight train thundered ever closer. Midnight hung heavy over Redstone Gulch, the blood moon swollen and cruel as it climbed high above the horizon. It painted the land in a sickly crimson glow, as though the desert itself bled under the weight of old sins. The shadows stretched long, twisting and clawing across cracked earth and splintered fences, and not a single cicada dared to chirp. Even the wind held its breath. Along the railroad tracks outside town, Silas Crowley and his men spread out like wolves around a wounded animal. Some crouched behind boulders, others took position in dry gullies or flattened themselves atop the rocks. Each man held a rifle or pistol, cocked and ready. The rails gleamed faintly, the cold metal beginning to tremble under the distant weight of an approaching train. Silas stood near the chained figure of Eleanor Voss, his pale face grinning in the blood-colored light. The iron chain binding her wrists and ankles rattled as she worked a jagged rock against a rusty link, every scrape hidden by the noise of the coming engine. "You hear that, darlin'?" Silas sneered, kicking a loose stone toward her. "That's your chariot, Callan. Better start praying." Eleanor didn't answer. Her lips were split, dirt streaked her face, and her left eye was nearly swollen shut. But she ground the rock harder, feeling the metal weaken under each desperate scrape. Out in the darkness, Jonah Cross moved like a shadow stitched from the earth itself. His boots crunched softly in the dust, his head tilted as he listened, not just for the sound of men, but for the small things, the rasp of breath, the faint scent of sweat carried on the dry wind, the telltale click of a rifle hammer drawn back too soon. He counted them. There were 6 on the left, behind a cluster of boulders. 3 more crouched along a dried-out riverbed, and another 4 stationed up on the rocks that flanked the rails. The train's whistle screamed in the distance, a long, mournful note that made the hairs on the back of Jonah's neck rise. In the hush of the moment, a soft tap came against Jonah's boot. He stopped. "Jonah," a boy's voice whispered. It was Caleb Weaver, a skinny orphan no older than 10, his face smudged with dust and his wide eyes reflecting the blood-red moonlight. Caleb clutched a stick like a rifle and looked up at the blind gunman as if seeing a legend rise from the grave. "I seen where they're hiding," the boy breathed. 3 behind them big rocks yonder, 2 in the gulch by the dead cottonwood, couple more on the slope near the rail trestle. Jonah crouched slightly, his face unreadable behind the dark lenses. "You did good, boy. Now get back. And stay low." Caleb hesitated only a second before darting off into the darkness, quick and silent as a jackrabbit. Jonah straightened, turning his head toward each spot Caleb had named. He committed them to memory, picturing the ground by feel and sound, plotting distances by the heaviness of bootfalls and the creak of leather. From down the track, the train loomed closer. The rhythmic thunder of the wheels grew louder, the rails humming like a stretched fiddle string. It would be upon them in minutes. Cross. Silas's voice cracked across the night like a whip. Last chance, you blind bastard. I can put you down right here. Or you can turn around and crawl back to whatever hole you've been hiding in. Jonah's hand rested on the ivory grip of his Colt. He let the silence stretch, the air between them thick as molasses, before answering. I didn't come here to crawl, Jonah called evenly. I came to bury you. A harsh laugh rose from the hidden riders. They were sure of their numbers, certain in the dark. To them, Jonah was just an old relic, a crippled legend barely worth a bullet. The train's headlamp came into view, a white eye piercing the gloom, and the shriek of its whistle sounded again, closer now, urgent and angry. Eleanor's hands ached, but the chain finally gave a brittle crack as a weakened link splintered. She stifled a gasp and worked to free her ankles. Her heart pounded in time with the approaching train. Jonah took a deep breath, the air dry and heavy on his tongue. He could smell them now, the sharp tang of gun oil, the sour sweat of fear and adrenaline, the faint reek of tobacco on Silas's breath. Every sound stood out, the shifting of boots, the press of a trigger. He moved. In one swift motion, Jonah drew his Colt, the polished ivory grip catching the crimson light. He fired. The first shot wasn't aimed at a man. It struck a lantern hanging from a pole by the tracks, plunging the scene into sudden shadow. The riders cursed, caught half-blind as their night-adjusted eyes struggled against the sudden darkness broken only by the blood moon's sickly glow. Jonah's second shot rang out before the glass hit the ground. A rider behind the rock screamed and collapsed, a bullet finding his throat by the sound of his ragged breath. The desert exploded in gunfire. Rifles cracked, bullets tearing through the night air, kicking up dust and sparks from stone. Jonah moved like water, each step calculated by the sense of earth underfoot and the echo of each shot. He fired again, striking a man on the slope near the trestle, the outlaw's death cry lost beneath the roar of the oncoming train. A shot grazed Jonah's shoulder, spinning him half a step. He dropped to one knee, rolling aside as another bullet shattered the ground where he'd stood. In the confusion, Eleanor kicked free of her ankle chain. Her fingers found a fallen revolver, cold, heavy, but welcome in her grip. Silas, cursing and furious, fired wildly toward the town, calling out to his men, "Kill him. He ain't no ghost. Bleed him dry." But they were losing their nerve. The legend of Jonah Cross, blind or not, was bleeding back into the night like smoke. Every shot that dropped one of their own sent another shard of fear through the survivors. Jonah reloaded with swift, practiced hands, his ears tracking the fading positions of the riders. He knew he had them. He could smell it in the shift of the air. The train screamed into sight, its massive bulk an unstoppable force, the engine's lanterns searing the gloom. Steam hissed, the ground trembling with its weight. Jonah raised his Colt one final time. "Last warning," he called, his voice like thunder over the rails. "Free the woman, or the train hits you first." And this time, no one laughed. The night shattered with Jonah Cross's opening shot, a single, perfect bullet cracking through the brittle air and striking the lantern on its post. The glass burst in a spray of sparks and flame, plunging the tracks into sudden darkness. The blood moon above cast a deep, crimson pall over the earth, but to most men's eyes, the world vanished in shadow. For Jonah, it was the same as it had been for years, a canvas of darkness painted with sound, scent, and the way the ground shifted beneath his feet. The outlaws cursed, their boots scraping against dirt and stone as they scrambled for cover. Jonah's Colt barked again, and a man's scream answered, cut short by a wet, choking gurgle. Another round roared from the darkness, and a second rider fell, his rifle clattering down the rocky slope. Jonah moved like a predator, one step at a time, his head tilted to catch every noise. He heard the sharp hiss of a man breathing through his teeth, the faint metallic clink of spurs, the shuffle of boot leather brushing dry earth. "Pick your shot," Jonah told himself, feeling the cold iron weight of grief knotting in his chest. "Like you did before it all burned." He remembered the night of the fire, the way his boys' laughter had filled the house, the scent of his wife's hair, the softness of their hands. Then came the smoke, the heat, the cruel crackle of flames. And somewhere in that inferno, Silas Crowley's voice, laughing as the world turned to ash. He'd crawled out blind, broken in ways no doctor could mend, his face seared and his eyes forever dark. The years after were filled with silence and canyons, sharpening his remaining senses, chasing the memory of his lost family and the name of the man who'd taken them. And now, that reckoning had come. Another breath, another step. Jonah felt a tremor in the ground. A man to his left. He snapped the Colt up, fired, and was rewarded with a grunt and a body hitting dirt. A sudden shout came from the town. "Get him, Jonah!" It was old Hank Carter's voice, shaky but fierce, and soon others followed. From behind barrels, porch posts, and saloon windows, townsfolk who'd cowered under Crowley's rule too long took up old hunting rifles, rusted shotguns, and whatever weapons they could find. Bullets cracked across the darkness, the townspeople emboldened by the sight of one man defying death. Eleanor's chains rattled as she clawed at the rusted links with her splintered rock. Her fingers bled, her wrists raw, but she didn't stop. Each pull on the chain weakened it further. The train's whistle screamed again, closer now, deafening in the still night, the ground trembling as iron wheels tore across the rails. Come on," she whispered through gritted teeth, wrenching the chain one final time. It gave. She collapsed onto the dirt, chest heaving, then reached out for a fallen revolver glinting in the red moonlight. It felt foreign in her hand, but its weight was a comfort. On the other side of the tracks, Silas Crowley's patience snapped. "Enough," he howled, storming from cover like a mad dog, his face twisted in fury, blood smearing one cheek from a grazing shot. He held a knife in one hand, a revolver in the other. "Come on, you blind bastard," he roared. "I'll carve your guts out myself." Jonah heard the charge, the heavy pounding of boots, the uneven breathing of a man driven past reason. He holstered his Colt, spreading his stance, waiting. Silas hit him like a charging bull, knocking both men to the ground in a tangle of limbs, dust, and blood. The knife flashed, nicking Jonah's shoulder as he rolled aside. Silas followed, fists hammering, one blow catching Jonah across the jaw. Jonah spat blood into the dirt. The pain was distant, a memory barely felt. His hands closed around Silas's wrist, forcing the knife away, and then a punch to the ribs drove the outlaw back. The two men grappled, snarling like wild animals under the blood moon's gaze. The train's headlamp grew brighter, an eye of blinding white that cut through the darkness. The engine roared closer, its scream a banshee's wail. Jonah's strength faltered as Silas drove him down, the knife inches from his throat. The world around them shrank to the press of flesh, the stink of blood and sweat, the hate in Silas's ragged breath. And then a shot cracked the night. Silas Crowley jerked upright, a look of stunned disbelief crossing his face as blood bloomed from his chest. He staggered, dropped the knife, and turned. Eleanor stood 10 paces away, the revolver trembling in her grip, her bruised face set in grim defiance. "This is for my husband," she said softly. Silas took one step toward her, then collapsed face first into the dirt. Jonah pushed himself up, bloodied and battered, his ears strained. Only a few scattered shots now, the riders breaking running. He drew his Colt again. A footstep behind him, the sharp intake of breath. Jonah pivoted, firing blind. One of the last Crowley riders dropped dead where he stood, a clean hole between his eyes. The train screamed past, brakes shrieking, steam billowing as the iron monster ground to a halt inches from where Silas's body lay. The massive engine loomed, the engineer leaning from the cab with wide, horrified eyes. What in the name of? Jonah didn't hear the rest. He lowered his Colt, his whole body aching, every old wound burning. The silence that followed was heavier than any gunfire. From the town, people began to emerge, tentative at first, then in growing numbers. "Hank Carter," Mrs. Kavanaugh, Caleb Weaver, the cowardly Marshal Avery, shamefaced and pale. Jonah felt Eleanor's presence before she spoke. "Thank you," she whispered, her hand brushing his arm. Jonah tipped his head toward her. "He took my family," he said, voice ragged. "I promised him I'd finish it." "You did," she said, a strange, tired relief in her voice. The townsfolk gathered around them, murmuring in awe. A few started cheering. Others wept. Avery cleared his throat, trying to puff his chest out. "Well, now, with Crowley gone, we can rebuild, you know. I'll see to it." "Save your breath," Jonah growled, and Avery shut his mouth. Jonah turned to Caleb, who looked up at him with something like hero worship in his wide eyes. "Keep your head down, boy," Jonah said softly. Then, after a moment, he reached out, pressing the ivory-handled Colt into Caleb's small, trembling hands. Some legends belong to the next ones. Without another word, Jonah started down the road out of town, the blood moon lighting his path. And behind him, Redstone Gulch began to remember what it felt like to be free. Dawn crept slow over Redstone Gulch, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rose, softening the jagged edges of the blood-soaked night. The last of the smoke hung low over the town like a morning veil, while the tracks gleamed wet with dew and darker stains no dawn could wash away. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the earth had witnessed something ancient and terrible and sacred all at once. The train sat still on the rails, steam hissing softly from its great iron lungs. Crows circled overhead, their harsh cries breaking the heavy silence as the townsfolk began to emerge from doorways and battered buildings, blinking in the fragile light. Marshal Grant Avery, dusty and haggard, wasted no time. He straightened his crooked badge, smoothed back his thinning hair, and strode to the center of town with all the confidence of a man who believed the world too weary to care about truth. "Well now," he declared loudly, hands on his hips as if he'd overseen the whole bloody affair. "Thanks to swift law and order, Redstone Gulch is rid of its problem. Crowley and his riders have been dealt with, and justice is served." The townsfolk didn't cheer. They didn't even nod. One by one, their gazes slid past Avery, to where Jonah Cross stood near the bloodied tracks. His face was a mask of dried blood, dust, and old scars. The ivory-handled Colt hung at his side, streaked with powder burns and the stain of the night's work. He didn't move, didn't speak. He stood as he always had, between the living and the dead, a sentinel made of old grief and harder resolve. Caleb Weaver stepped forward, still clutching the Colt Jonah had pressed into his small hands. He looked up at Avery with wide, unblinking eyes. "You didn't do nothing, Marshal," the boy said, voice small but steady. "It was Jonah Cross saved us." A murmur rippled through the gathered townsfolk. "Jonah and Eleanor," someone added. "She killed Silas herself," said another. "Ain't no badge stopped him. Was them two what did it." Avery's face flushed a deep, ugly red, but he said nothing. Jonah removed his hat and then, slowly, his dark glasses. It was the first time in years anyone in Redstone Gulch had seen his face unhidden, and what they saw silenced even the most stubborn tongues. His eyes were ruined, milky and scarred, clouded by the fire that had taken his family and his sight. Deep lines carved his weather-worn face, a map of a life marked by sorrow. But there was strength there, too, and something older than fear. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Eleanor stepped forward, her face still bruised but her spine straight as a fence post. "I didn't know if you were still alive," she said softly. Jonah turned his head toward her voice, brow furrowed. "And I didn't know you existed." She managed a small, sad smile. "I was Thomas's niece by marriage. I married into the Voss family the year after it happened. When Crowley killed them, I thought I was alone. My husband, Thomas's brother, he died last year. Since then, it's just been me." Jonah's jaw clenched, a sharp breath catching in his throat. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Then we're what's left." Eleanor reached out and took his hand. It was rough, calloused, scarred, a hand made for violence. But he didn't pull away. In that touch, a lifetime of grief, loss, and long-delayed reckoning passed between them. "I'll keep the store," she said quietly. and I'll keep your name safe here. What you did, what you've always done." Jonah's lips twitched in something close to a smile. The townsfolk edged closer now, shedding their fear like old skin. Hank Carter stepped forward with a battered badge in his hand. The one Avery wore, never worth the metal it was stamped on. "Jonah," Hank rasped, we want you to have this. This town needs a lawman, not some coward hiding behind paperwork. You saved us once. Let it be your town now." A chorus of murmured agreement rose around them. Men who had kept their heads down, women who had pulled their children inside when Crowley's riders came, all of them ready now to follow a man who'd faced down death in the dark and walked away. But Jonah shook his head. "I ain't meant for towns," he said, voice low. "My war's done, but peace ain't in me." A hush followed his words. He turned to Caleb, crouching so his blind eyes met the boy's. "Keep this safe," Jonah said, closing Caleb's hands around the Colt once more. "It's yours now. You stand for what's right. You protect the weak. And you shoot straight when it's time." Caleb nodded, his throat too tight for words. Jonah rose, tipped his hat to Eleanor, and began walking, not toward the saloon, nor the marshal's office, nor even the old road out of town. He moved east, toward the canyons where the sun rose slow, and the wind spoke in tongues only men like him could hear. No one stopped him, and as he passed the bloodied tracks, the scorched earth, the scattered bodies of Crowley's riders, the dawn broke in earnest, washing away the remnants of night. The legend of Redstone Gulch was born. By noon, word had already begun to spread. A blind gunman, returned from the dead, had faced down an outlaw gang alone. A woman, wronged and left for dead, had fired the shot that ended Silas Crowley. The cowardly marshal exposed. The people rising, finding courage in the shadow of a man long thought lost. They spoke the name Jonah Cross in every saloon, every campfire, and every dusty road between here and Elkhorn Pass. Some added embellishments, said he could hear a man's heartbeat from 50 paces, or that he could shoot a man dead by the sound of his breath. Others claimed he vanished into thin air, a spirit sent by the restless dead. But those who had seen him, those who'd felt the air crackle with every draw of his Colt, knew the truth was enough without gilding. At the edge of the canyons, where the rocks rose like broken teeth against the sky, Jonah Cross paused. He turned his face to the sun, feeling its warmth, listening to the land breathe. The war was over. The grief never would be. But for the first time in years, he felt a weight lift. The promise he'd made in fire and blood kept. And somewhere behind him, Redstone Gulch would heal. The narrator's voice, rough as dry timber, closes the tale. Some say he's still out there, where the canyons swallow the sun, and the wind carries the names of the dead. A blind gunman, a revenant, a man made of loss and grit and iron, waiting for justice to call his name again.